Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I am your host, Benedict Hein. If you're new to the show, welcome. So stoked to have you. If you are already a listener, thank you for coming back. Always glad to have you. And today we're gonna talk about a book that I just finished. And Malcolm is just halfway through it, I think. It's called The Creative Act by Rick Rubin. It's a fascinating and very inspiring read that made me want to talk about it on the podcast because there are a lot of interesting things to discuss and unpack in what he says. And I might use more of what I learned from this book in future episodes, but for now, I want to start with a very important concept that is at the heart of this book. So in this episode, I'm going to read a lot from my notes here, and then we'll discuss it together. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Malcolm. So as always, I'm not doing this alone. I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood, who's finally back on this podcast. Hello, my friend.
Hey, man. How are you, Benny?
I'm good. Thank you. How are you?
Good. It's great to see you. It's great to be chatting with you again. That was, I think, 5 weeks without doing an episode together, which is like our longest ever. Probably didn't appear that way to our listeners because we pre-record multiple episodes and stuff like that. But I missed you, man. It's great to see you.
Yeah, totally. I missed you. I missed you so much. Like this, we made it through without a break. But I'm so glad that we are back in a normal routine. It's kind of
Definitely.
Kind of a weird start though, because we started on Monday, which is our usual podcast recording day, but then had technical difficulties and had to reschedule to Friday now. But I hope that from now on in the next weeks, we're going to be back to our routine because I really missed that. So
yeah, I think we're back. We're back at it, which is awesome. Hey, I've got some musical banter / news that I'm excited about. An artist that I have mixed for that is, I believe, a listener of this podcast. I mean, she definitely self-records all of her stuff.
Okay.
Darian Gerard. She got a festival spot on the island here. Actually, while you're here, I'm going to add, Benny's coming to Vancouver Island in Canada for my wedding coming up pretty soon here, listeners, which I'm freaking so stoked about. But while he's here, there's a big music festival, and Darian, this artist, scored a spot on the main stage and needed a band, so I'm going to play with her. I'll be guitar in the band. It's going to be awesome. I haven't played a live show in 3 years, I think. So
really,
that's
I thought you
exciting.
did some quick ones in between.
Did I forget something? Because
or was it just jamming with friends, bands and stuff?
I think it was just jamming. I don't think I've done a show.
Oh, wow. Then it's even more exciting.
Yeah, very exciting. And it's like a huge, massive stage. I think it's one of the biggest stages in North America, actually. So that'll be cool.
Wow, awesome. Let me ask you one question. You told me that last week, or on Monday before the last attempt to record this episode, but there was one question I forgot to ask. Do you actually, with the wedding coming up and everything, and do you actually
I think that's a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, okay, yeah, no, that too. But you have to know if that's a good idea or not. But do you actually get to practice? Because I think, I mean, isn't it hard to play for someone else and play their songs and prepare properly and all that
without practicing? Yeah, it is. I've been really cramming right now. I feel like the further from the wedding, the more time I'm gonna have. So I'm just really, really putting a lot of time into the songs right now.
But you're doing that already,
I know,
yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we're actually doing our first almost full band practice tonight with the band that we put together for it, which is it's going to be awesome. It's all past bandmates of mine, aside from Darian, our kind of core talent. So just kind of built a band of colleagues and friends around her, which is going to be awesome.
Awesome, so cool. Because I'm having a hard time preparing our own songs for my band, with the few shows that we play. Every single time I have to put a few days of practice in, almost an hour here and there, to just get back in shape. But playing for someone else, I've never done that actually, but I can imagine it's kind of hard. So
yeah, I'm loving it though. It's it's so great flexing these musical muscles again, and learning. There's a whole memorization side to music that is very specific to music that I kind of had not realized I had lost, where you have to associate patterns with each other in order to memorize these different progressions and shapes and what key you're in, what frets you're playing, and that's been fascinating, getting that going again. There's a small physical side to a guitar. It's not the most physical thing, but there is definitely an aspect. And then making tones. I'm loving making tones.
That would have been my next question. What's the rig you're going to be playing?
Oh man, I'm pushing the Kemper to its full capabilities this time, and I like really regret not doing that sooner.
Okay.
I definitely was scraping the surface of making the Kemper a stage beast with Band of Rascals. I pretty much treated it like a giant pedal board, maybe, and with like a couple amps kind of thing with Band of Rascals, but more so it was like I had my amp, and these are the different gain patches with different effects patches kind of thing. Very much a pedal board setup, where this is like I've got one of those for every song. So I click on a song title, it loads a different amp for each section of the song that I think is necessary. And I've got like a button that says verse, a button that says chorus, a button that says verse 2.
On the remote?
Pre-chorus, on the remote. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I have like each part of the song dialed in perfectly with like the exact tempo already mapped to it, because we're playing to a click. So it's just like, I click on that and there's a crazy trem effect that is perfectly timed to do 130 beats per minute. And it's so awesome. It's just like, it's so great. And being able to change amps at different times is cooler than I thought it would be.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds really cool. Does it make you nervous though? I mean, it probably works, but in my head, like there's so many moving parts, and like if something goes wrong, then it really goes wrong, sort of. So I don't know.
Yeah, like if the Kemper went down, I don't know what I would do. I've thought about that.
That shouldn't happen. But like everything, is there anything else that can go wrong? It's just the amount of variables,
it's actually
probably because I've always just played an amp. I had a Kemper for a while, but I used like an amp with a few pedals, like you said. But like in my mind, it's like I have my amp and a few things, and I know what they all do. But like having this massive setup, I don't know, for whatever reason, it makes me nervous, and I always think that things could not work for. I don't know.
Yeah, no, but it's actually simpler because I've like tried to do similar things with real pedals and stuff, but you can't. You're doing like the pedal dance, stepping like on 3 pedals at one time and skipping around. Where this is one button changes everything, So it's kind of simplified, and I've got them laid out in order. So it kind of also is helping me with the memorization of like, I don't really remember when what part comes next, but I just click the next button. And it says chorus. It's going to be the chorus next,
Yeah.
So it's kind of like
that's the thing I was wondering if like I would have to quadruple check that everything's correct and that there's no mistake that I made programming it, basically,
Yeah, you definitely have to dial that in perfectly for sure. But I've got if you're watching the podcast on YouTube, I'm in my studio here. I can just load up the songs. I can load up the Pro Tools sessions if I want, because I mixed the most latest EP. So it's like I can actually look at every track and get everything I need figured out, kind of thing. So it's more work up front, but it makes it way simpler after, because I don't have to remember what delay pedal to click, what reverb needs to be on, if I had a boost for the solo or not. I just click solo and it knows everything.
Awesome.
So really all I have to think about is playing the part and clicking one button. It's awesome.
That's so cool. And you didn't switch to anything new yet, like because you were thinking about the Quad Cortex and other things. You just stuck with your trusty Kemper?
I really was, and I was keeping an eye out, but I think I'm pretty convinced with the Kemper again. For a couple of reasons. Wow, we are really going amp guitar tone here.
yeah, that's totally fine. We haven't done that in a while.
Yeah. Couple things. I updated the Kemper for doing this, and they've made some pretty big improvements on the software side of things. Like using the rig managers, pretty greatly improved. That process is awesome. And pretty close to awesome, I would say. And then they've also added some new features that I haven't even got to try yet. They're in like beta right now, but they've got liquid profiling. Have you heard about that, Benny?
I've heard it. I got a newsletter about it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So for our listeners, a Kemper used to be a snapshot. So it would profile an amp setup. You've got a real amp, and then you would have that like exact sound locked in, which is crazy. But it was just that one sound. So if you wanted to make it, a little less distorted or turn down the treble, it didn't really respond like the amp. If you did that on the Kemper, it was kind of like you kind of just had the snapshot that you actually captured it in. But with liquid profiling, they claim to have solved that, and you're essentially stealing the soul of the amp entirely. And you can now, if you have a JCM 800 profile and you crank the top end, it's going to respond like a JCM 800 does, not like a Kemper does.
Not at all, basically, like a Marshall does with the EQ.
So. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Kemper section on EQ section on a Kemper is not like any amp. People don't like using it at all.
Yeah.
But now it's like all of the knobs are kind of meant to replicate what the actual amp would do. So that's going to be very helpful, especially for me with how I'm used to Marshall amps. And how, if I turn up the gain or turn down the gain, it does something totally different. So very cool. Looking forward to that. And they've got USB audio apparently now too, which I didn't know was even going to be a thing. But just being able to record via one USB cable, that's pretty cool.
Oh, you can use it as an interface now, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. That's neat. Awesome. Yeah, that all sounds great, man. And I mean, yeah, that's the perfect setup, honestly. Like it's so crazy what you can do, and that what like just switching amps like that, and the whole setups like that throughout, even not even from song to song, but throughout the song.
Yeah,
it's insane.
It's wild. Yeah, they definitely made it modern enough to compete with stuff like the Quad Cortex for me now. So I'm in.
Awesome. And which guitar are you gonna play? One or multiple?
My it's not on the wall behind me right now, but my wine red Les Paul is going to be my main guitar. I was going to borrow I had an Evertune, and I sold it, if anybody remembers, because I got a camera addiction now.
Yeah.
But I was going to borrow that back off our Derek Madden, friend of the podcast. And he was totally willing to let me, but I dialed all these tones in with the Les Paul, and it's a 35-minute set, I think. So I'm like, I can handle tuning for 35 minutes. It's okay.
Yes, it's okay. It's totally okay. Awesome. And that guitar is like, you're used to it. It's your guitar, and you've been playing it for a while.
Yeah, so that's my main axe. So gotta rock it.
Awesome. So cool. So stoked. Yeah, when was the date again? After the wedding, is it right? Yeah, I have it on my calendar anyways.
Gonna be June 30th, Lake Town Shakedown's the festival. Sick lineup. It's gonna be fun. Yeah, we'll try and figure out if we can steal you away from your travels around the island for that, Benny. That'd be super fun.
Yes. I will make sure. I will try and make that happen. Yeah, that's gotta be fun for sure.
We'll try and make you our crew roadie or something and get you in with us.
Totally down to that. And I actually got a crew if you want me. Like, I'm down to do whatever. So awesome, perfect, great. Yeah, so that was the episode on the recent Kemper update.
on the news of Kemper, we've updated everyone.
Yeah, liquid profiling. So yeah, I think actually, but still one thing I wanted to say about this. I think this was the one thing that they actually had to fix, and I'm so glad that they did, because that was that plus the caps, but the caps were easily replaceable. But that was the one thing that I never really liked about the Kemper. And if they really fix that and it works and feels like that, then there's really, it's almost a perfect device, although it's more than 10 years old at this point, but
Yeah. Well, that's like, and one more thing that I really love is that, like 10 years ago, people bought this Kemper and they're still adding new features, and they're still saying, hey, there's no Kemper 2 on the horizon. This is the Kemper. We're just going to keep making it better for you, which is so refreshing in how businesses work these days, where like you buy something and within 12 months it's obsolete because they've abandoned it and made a new product. It's just like they just keep investing into the thing I already own and making it better. It's like, this is cool. I'm pretty grateful for it right now.
Yeah, totally. Partly though, and I don't know if that's entirely true, but I've read it a couple of times. Part of that is though that I think the chips that they built it around back then are not available anymore, and it's kind of difficult to port it to a new thing. So I'm not even sure they can make a Kemper 2 at this point. So I've read that it's like not really possible, so they kind of have to continue supporting that. But it's a good thing either way. Like it's an amazing thing that things don't become obsolete, and apparently hardware is not the limit here. It's just about the software and how they capture it, and you can always develop that. So that's just great.
Yeah, it works for me.
No problem there.
One last thing that I want to talk to you about before we get into this is not Kemper related.
Okay.
Yeah, nobody has to skip forward 30 seconds. It's fine. I just want to put in everyone's ear that we are absolutely planning to have a self-recording band meetup in Canada on Vancouver Island while Benny and I are here. So if you live on the island, which I think there's a good core group of listeners from the probably early day listeners from when we started the podcast, which is awesome, that live on the island, totally want to see you at this. It would be such a fun time. If you are nearby on the mainland, or it's just up. You can make it. Please do feel free to travel for it, but of course, no pressure. So we don't have a date yet, but maybe we should encourage people to reach out so that we can start kind of getting organized and knowing who wants to come and stuff like that. So do reach out to us. Just wanted to get you as much notice as possible on that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so cool you brought that up. What's the best way for people to reach out? Should they just DM us? I mean, you can always email podcast at theselfrecordingband.com. So I always see that, and I know that's about the podcast. So that will definitely be seen, and I will react to it. That is one way. And then if you know Malcolm or myself or me personally, whatever, you can just reach out wherever, I guess, and we'll hopefully see it. But do so, and that would be so cool to have a group of people on the other side of the world, basically, for me to and meet up there.
Yeah,
Perfect.
Really looking forward to that. But yeah, do reach out. Kind of, I don't mind whatever way you want to just let us know that you're in. It's going to be near the end of June sometime, probably. So around that time frame.
Awesome, perfect. Really cool. All right, so let's get to it. I wanted to, let's skip my banter part for the next time. Then that's like too much.
I took it all with Kemper.
No, that's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. Let's get to this episode. I just want to say, if you're watching this on YouTube, we always have a timestamp below the video where you can skip the banter if you're not interested in this sort of stuff. I know a lot of people do actually want us to do that, so we keep doing it. But in case you didn't see it this time, next time you're watching a YouTube video from us, like a YouTube podcast, you can just skip the banter by clicking on that timestamp, and then you're straight right here where the episode starts. All right, so
about that Kemper. All right, well, we can talk about the real thing.
Totally. So back to the real thing. So the episode is called Creation. So I don't know, it's a working title, but it's like about the concept of like creation versus craft and the two phases that Rick Rubin explains in his book. There's much more to it that he talks about in the book, but this is at the heart of the book, really, and something I wanted to talk about. I've made a lot of notes. It's like almost a little summary of it, where I'm going to read a few things here just so I don't forget it, and then we'll discuss them on the show. So the thing that I want to talk, like what it is that we're talking about, is that Rubin discusses the phases of a creative project, basically, which he calls the seed phase, the experimentation phase, the craft phase, and the completion phase. This is sort of the framework that he uses. And by the way, should we explain who Rick Rubin is real quick before we dive into this? Like, just if you don't know him, he's one of the most famous record producers on this planet. He's, I don't know how many platinum records and Grammys and whatnot he's won. He's worked with everybody. Like, it's insane. Just look him up. What makes him sort of special is his whole, like, the whole brand, or this figure that he is, basically. He's, look him up and do some research. I think he has he's a producer, but he's the classic sort of type of producer that's, these days, people don't think of that as a producer, basically, I think. So he doesn't operate the board, or like he doesn't mix, he doesn't engineer. He's basically sitting in the room, observing the situation and guiding people to get the best performances out of them, and to make sure that the songs are the best they can be, and that and he's super great at building teams of engineers and like people with technical ability. He claims to have no technical ability, which is probably not entirely true, but he says that. But he's really like a movie director, basically. He's in the room and he has such a great feel for unique art and emotion, and he can, I think, he's a good leader in the room also. He can just guide people very well. He built teams, and he's just views the whole creative process a little differently than most people, I guess. And his results speak for themselves. Like, he's very, very successful in all kinds of genres. That's also remarkable. He's done from hip hop to heavy metal to, like, all kinds of things, and it just seems to work. So
yeah. I do, like, I feel like I want to say just a couple artists he's worked with, because it gives you an idea of the scope. Like, he's done Kanye, he's done System of a Down, he's done Red Hot Chili Peppers. I think that's just literally scraping the surface.
Metallica.
I think he worked with Johnny Cash, as well.
Johnny Cash.
Like, literally every genre with the most successful artist in that genre he's worked with. I would say he's probably indisputably the most successful record producer of all time.
Yeah, I would say so.
It's ridiculous how successful he's been in all of these different genres, which should be impossible. It's just wild.
Yeah. Totally.
So obviously he's onto something.
He's onto something. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Okay. So, and so in this book, he discussed these phases, and this made me think about the way I guide people through the process of making a record, because it provides a framework that makes a lot of sense to me, and it will help you understand a couple of things. It helps you understand when and when not to plan things, when and how to use limitations and when not to use limitations, when to create without an agenda, rules or limitations, when and the difference between craft and creation. Because when I explain the way I think about making records, when I explain that to people, for example, in our coaching program, then there's a lot of planning involved, a lot of systematic things, a lot of like processes. And this doesn't sound very creative, but I always think about it as things that help me be more creative. And sometimes people have a hard time understanding what I mean there. And Ruben explains that better than I do, actually. And this was just eye opening for me how he separates the creation from the craft, which is what I want to do, but I wasn't able to put it in a framework like he does. So I wanted to talk about it on this podcast, and maybe that clarifies a few things. And so yeah, I don't know. It's probably, you said, Malcolm, when you listened to the book or you started listening to it, that it challenged some things that you thought to be true, or like the way you think about things in some way, because you are also like a very systematic, you have a very systematic approach, and you're a very you like to
Yeah.
plan things and execute and show up and do the work and see results, and yeah.
It's like kind of just put my nose to the grind until the job's done is the way I definitely can think about approaching even creative things. It's just like, all right, let's just lock ourselves into this room until we get a song done. Let's put in the hours. And while that can totally work, this book is definitely challenging me to think that maybe there's easier or more creative, focused ways of accomplishing that, and maybe you don't have to make it such a grind. And I'm still listening to the book, so Benny's going to be leading this one a lot, kind of thing, and we're going to be discussing the ideas from this book. But I do recommend checking it out already. I think Benny and I both found it started off a little too, I don't even know how to describe it, cerebral for us to like think that we were going to like it, but then you start kind of getting it and being like, okay, maybe the fact that I'm not instantly gelling with this is why it's a good idea to listen and try some of these ideas.
Yes, exactly. Cool. So I'm just gonna really quickly tell people like the way I like the process that I typically teach, and there's actually it's not that different from what Rick Rubin does. Just so you know what we're talking about and why there's even like different phases and why some things are like more creative than others maybe. So I know that many people find it hard, as I said, to plan art, and that makes sense to me, to follow a process and to be intentional when it's something so creative as like creating art. And I always ask people to tell me why they are making a record, what they want to sound it and feel like, what they are trying to achieve, how they're going to make that happen. And people have a hard time answering that oftentimes. So it's important to understand that not every part of making a record has to be planned. Not every decision needs a why behind it, especially not in the early phases. So there's a time and place, I think, for experimenting, going with the flow and working without any limitations or rules or goals in mind. And then there's a place for just executing and using skill, knowledge, and a strategic process to bring that initial idea to life. And so I realized that the way I used to explain and teach it can easily be misunderstood. So this book provided a perfect opportunity to make this more clear and straightforward. So the process that I teach is that at the beginning, there's something that I call the foundation, where it's writing, arranging, capturing first simple demos and practicing and like just playing a lot. So that part is where there are not many rules. It's just creating something from scratch out of thin air. Basically, you're writing, you're arranging it, you're optimizing a little bit, you're capturing the ideas, and that's pretty much it. Then the next part that I teach is you choose. It's about the gear. So gear doesn't come first. That is the next part. You choose the equipment you need for the project, and you learn how to set it up correctly. And then you do pre-production, which is you prepare yourself and the songs for the actual recording session, and you learn the gear, and like you just make sure that you're prepared for actually recording it. Then it gets more and more into like what would be sort of the crafts phase, where you do the final setup, the final instrument setup, you choose the mics, you do like mic placement, you engineer so that the initial idea that you had actually comes out of the speakers the way you want it. Then there's the recording session itself, where it's about capturing the best possible performances. Everything else has been taken care of. And then there's comping and consolidating, choosing the best takes, committing to a final version, then editing, cleanup, correction, and that sort of stuff, and then mixing and mastering. And at every stage, there's a bit of both creation and craft involved, I think. So I want to discuss that. To me, when I ask people in the beginning about their why, I think one mistake that I made probably often was that I didn't explain that the why isn't the first thing before you ever start writing anything or capturing it. I think you have to when there's some sort of inspiration or idea, um, or something just comes out of you, then you can absolutely just play around with that and capture it and experiment and write whatever without any rules or without knowing why exactly. And then at some point, I think when you have, at least that's the way I think about it, when you have like some raw ideas and sort of a backlog of like things that you capture, things that inspire you, and it starts to take on some sort of form and develop into some sort of serious project that could eventually be a record, then it's time to think about the goal, the why. Like, why do you even want this? Why do you want to follow through with this? Like, is there anything you want to achieve for yourself as a band or artist? Is there a certain way you want this to sound? And if so, why? Do you want to get on certain playlists? Do you want to sound like a certain band, or is there a certain unique thing you do? Then all these questions start to make sense. But I think only after a phase of doing whatever. And I think honestly, this phase never stops. I think as an artist, you are always constantly inspired by everything that's around you, by things you experience in your life, past experiences, things you see. So the writing actually never stops. And a lot of good writers that I know, they just constantly make notes of all kinds of things, and they not always work on those on the spot, but they capture things or like they note things, and then there are certain sessions or times when they just sit down and turn these or play around with these and turn them into actual drafts. And I think that part never really stops, and it doesn't need any rules or plans. And that's pretty much what Rubin says as well. So I wonder about all of that. Like, I wonder how you see that, Malcolm, and if you ever think about it like that. Do you start with a plan and then start to write the first thing, or do you sometimes just for whatever reason have an idea in mind and you play around with it without really knowing why you do this or what the goal is?
Right. Yeah, I always just kind of waited for an idea and then tried to capitalize on that idea happening. Like, so you just kind of play guitar until all of a sudden you're excited about a riff. All of a sudden you just kind of like, oh, I'm onto something here, and then I would just try and make a song out of that on the spot. And there's a couple things that are discussed in the book. There's like that creativity kind of has like this short little time limit usually, and you want to squeeze every bit you can out of that little gift you've been given of like, oh, all of a sudden it's on, creative ideas are happening, you're inspired. So and I totally agree with that. Milk it for everything you can. Don't be like, oh, I'm onto something, but I'm just gonna go make a coffee and I'll come back to it. Just sit there and use it up. That is definitely a hugely important thing. And when a guy like Rick Rubin says that, it's like, oh, he's seen this in countless successful artists. Like it is a thing. It's not just me. I'm not crazy. It's like you have to really use that. The tap is turned on, so use the water coming out of it. But then the other thing that I think is related to this that I wish I had done is just capture them right away as well. Because sometimes you get excited about something and you try and write it on the spot, and then you kind of lose your excitement about it. And you can't really see how it's going to be useful or work with whatever your current project is. And then for me, I would usually just kind of abandon it. It had to be like truly special and the perfect thing for that time with my band to really survive that stage. And if it was like a song that I didn't see our band using, I would just stop playing it and then just hope that another idea would come along that was more in line with my band. And that, I think, was a real mistake and a kind of a shame. If I just captured it, there might have been a time down the road where it would have been the right thing, either for my band or for a different artist entirely, or for an artist in the studio. Maybe it's just the sound that I've made. It's just like a sonic idea. It doesn't even have to be a piece of music. There's just so much value in capturing it. And I didn't really consider this, but the best artists that I've worked with have this vault of things. So if you sit down to play with them and you're like, hey, you got anything? They're like, yeah, I've got this thing I was just thinking about that I wrote a while ago. And you hear people about like, oh yeah, I wrote this song 3 years ago and couldn't figure out the chorus. And then I just got it. And now here's this song that people like. Like it doesn't have to all be in one stretch. You just kind of have to harvest it while you can, capture it, and then complete it when the next burst comes.
Absolutely agreed. Like what I do, and I'm not even a writer. I don't even write songs for anybody right now, but I still do it. Is like I always carry a very tiny, small like notebook with me, like a physical notebook and some sort of pen, and because sometimes it's business ideas, sometimes it's general life things, and sometimes it's just creative things where just some observations, things I notice that I would whatever reason want to write down, and I constantly create this sort of backlog, and it could turn into lyrics, it could turn into a business idea, it could turn into a song. So I always have that, and I've seen a lot of writers who write lyrics do that a lot, where they would take. And I also interviewed a lot of people on my other podcast. I was talking to a bunch of really good songwriters where they said they would take the notebook anywhere. Like when they go to a bar, they have it with them and they have an interesting conversation or something super funny happens. They just make some quick notes so they won't forget, because that could be a really great story for a song. And so that is one thing. And then I also have a system on my phone, it's very simple. I just use the voice recorder feature on the phone, where I would just, if I have a melody in my head or something, I would just quickly record it there, give it a name, and dump it there and don't even think about it. And then the important thing about that is, though, so that you're actually going to use this stuff, is that on a regular basis, not so much these days, but when I was writing more, I'd do that. I would go through this whole catalog and quickly, like once a week or every 2 weeks or once a month, I don't know. I would go through that really quickly and just be like, okay, this is not something I want to pursue. Like, this is crap or whatever. And I'm going to filter out the crap. I'm not going to delete it. I'm going to move it to a folder somewhere on a hard drive or a computer. But that's the thing I probably never look into again. Then there's the sort of someday maybe thing where I'm not sure about if this is going to turn into something. And then there are some cool things, some nuggets where I'm like, okay, I got something there, and this might turn into something. And so with this constant curating sort of process that I have, it makes it really easy. Then when I sit down and actually want to write a song, I can look into the folder with the good stuff and can ignore all the rest and can pull that out. And then I assume if I was to write a song right now, it would be pretty easy to dive in there and put a bunch of riffs together. And probably not the best song in the world, but there's some ideas there. So
totally. Yeah, that's great. There was 2 songs on the last Band of Rascals album. There's Holler, which is like our most successful song ever, and another song called Altitude, which is probably like my favorite. And both of the main riffs of those songs I wrote around Marcus, our drummer. One, Altitude, I wrote in Mexico while we were backpacking together, and I was just jamming away on a little guitar, and he recorded it because he liked it on his phone. I didn't. I was just like, okay, that's cool. And I completely forgot about it. And same with the main riff for Holler. I think we were touring in our RV and he recorded it on his phone. And then,
That's the theme song of this podcast, right? Holler. Is it the one?
No, I think that's Seas Coming Down.
Oh, yeah. You're right. But Holler, you sent me that too. I think we were talking about that.
Yeah, it was probably a consideration. Holler, I think, was... Oh, no, that was Control. I don't know. But anyway. It's like it was our lead single. That's the one that we got charting on the radio and stuff like that. And yeah, it's just like because Marcus had the foresight to capture the idea, and then we're trying to write, and he's like, what about this? And I was like, what's that? He's like, that was you. It's like, okay, I'll relearn my own riff. And yeah, I'm so glad that he had the foresight to capture that, because at the moment I didn't see how it fit, but it obviously fit. It was like our lead single. It's a very important thing that he captured. So very important. Capitalize on this stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, totally. And yeah, and I think that part, that's the seed phase, basically. That just never stops for artists. I think if you are an artist, you identify as an artist. You are an artist in everything you do, basically. And so that's also something he says, where you can't really... it's a concept that he talks about, where it's so hard to find a balance in a naturally unbalanced artist's life, because of course there's other things in your life and you have maybe a day job or other things to juggle, but as you said, you can't really force those moments. Like, they happen sometimes and inspiration comes out of nowhere, and the challenge is to balance this naturally unbalanced thing. And because you are an artist 24/7, sometimes that means you actually would go to bed now because you have to get up tomorrow, but right now you have this awesome idea and you sit down with your guitar, and before you know it, it's like 3 a.m. because you had to sit there until it turned into something and you just couldn't stop because it just flows. And that's just part of it. And a lot of people have to like do this, and then there's days where nothing happens. So you constantly capture, and then from what you capture, there might be these sessions where you just need to turn it into something because you feel like it. And I think that's a struggle, but also you just gotta let it happen. You gotta embrace that, I think, and it's a gift. It's a struggle, but it's also a gift because not everybody can do that. And he says to really embrace that, to always observe, pay attention, capture the seed, and then take these notes and develop them into drafts without any rules, without any limitations, and without any plans. So he says like we should create what we feel like creating and let our intuition and inspiration guide us. And whatever comes out becomes the art. And some things will be good, others not so much. We just keep creating and experimenting and let it happen, and not let any plans or intentions get in the way in this early phase. And this is why I wanted to talk about it. It's so important because I always thought about it the same way, but I get now when I ask people about the why and the plans and everything that it gets them stuck before they even started. Basically, they think about these things before they even have the seed or develop the draft. And I think those questions that I always ask, I'm assuming that people are capturing and creating all the time. And then when they want to turn it into something eventually, then these questions become more important, but not before you have this initial inspiration and something to work with. Because there, I think these plans become unnecessary limitations. And this is really important, I guess, because sometimes I think we don't know what we're going to create. We might be, there's a great example that Rick Rubin talks about where he says, if you have the plan to write, if you think that artists have like a social or political responsibility or whatever, and you have the plan to write something with a clear political message and you want to change the world with that, and you plan it all out and then you start writing, it's probably not gonna work. Like chances that this is gonna work and resonate with people are pretty low because you're gonna use a bunch of like cliches and like phrases that you heard somewhere else, and it's probably not gonna be that awesome. But if you just do whatever you feel like and you keep creating, keep writing, keep letting the influences and your beliefs and values and all of that, if you let that happen and turn into art, then something that was never intended as such might become the anthem for a revolution. And just because it's who you are, what you believe in, and what you made. And a lot of those great songs weren't intended to be that, they just happened and then it worked. And I think that is a very cool thing to think about, that sometimes you just can't force it, and it actually might not even work if you force it. So
Yeah, it probably won't.
yeah.
I'm going to keep derailing Benny's
No,
carefully crafted
do
outline
it. That's
here,
why I'm here.
but you're inspiring me to think about things. And I think one of the most important takeaways was that, like, I think we've all had that moment where a song just pours out of you, like start to finish. That's like the ideal situation, and you just can't believe it happened. And invariably, those are like great songs as well. It's just so fantastic. But unfortunately, we all know that that's also extremely rare, and you can't seem to make that happen. and what the point I'm getting at is that inspiration is very, very rare. So when you get it, that's why it's so important to capture it then and there, because you don't know when it's going to come again. And you also don't have the luxury of choosing when you want it. So you might have written the album and be recording that album now, and more inspiration is coming. Don't just stop capturing ideas because you're now recording the songs you've already written. You got to keep harvesting the new seed, or planting the new seeds, so that you can harvest them later in the cycle. I like to break things into stages, but this is one thing you can't break into stages. You just have to keep the planting of new seeds constantly going, because wasting these little bursts of inspiration that come along the way is a huge mistake, I think.
Absolutely. And just don't put any, like, take the pressure off. You don't assume that all of these seeds need to become great pieces of art.
Yeah,
Most of them won't. Just take the pressure off, capture them anyways, and then you write 10 crappy pieces and then one good one will show up. That's just normal.
absolutely.
Uh, that's also where a lot of people get stuck, where they have one idea and then they just focus on that one idea, trying to force it into something, when instead you could just move on with your day, capture more ideas until there's something that just naturally wants to be developed into something, and
Yeah.
don't assume that every single seed has to become a tree. Like in this case, it doesn't. And so, yeah. But then at some point, the craft becomes more important, I think. And as soon as we have a vision, and this is also what Rick Rubin says here, basically, is as soon as we have a vision, as soon as we have a draft that we really like, we need to make sure that it sounds and feels exactly right, so that it has the impact we want it to have, that it actually has a chance to be heard, to reach an audience, and to get our message out into the world. And that's where more of the planning and also the skills, the craft, becomes important, where to the point where you might not even be able to do it yourself. So in the case of Rick Rubin, he can guide artists to turn these seeds into drafts and create a cool vision and a cool piece of art, basically. But then when it comes to actually executing that so that it ends up being on a record and sounding a certain way, he doesn't do that himself. He builds a team. He hires the right people who are basically, craftsmen and women who know what they're doing. And then at that point, plans and also deadlines become important, because you want this to be done, to be finished. And you don't. And sometimes if you keep it open forever with no limits, no rules, no planning, no deadlines and everything, it just ends up nowhere. So at some point, I think you gotta do it in a more structured and processed, systematic way, and use processes and also deadlines. And he says that too. He says sometimes people are surprised when they enter a studio session with him. They expect it all to be super chill, and he says they expect one big music party in the room, basically, with no rules in it, and everything's just super creative. And they are surprised how structured the process actually is once they are in the studio, because the creative part has already been done. And then when they're actually creating the record, it's very structured, and they are focused on, because they don't want to lose what they already have, and they want to get it done before it's gone, basically, and before nobody is feeling it anymore, basically, if that makes sense. So
right.
At some point, there has to be rules and limitations, and you can even use limitations to your advantage. You can even invent rules for yourself, because he always says that there are no general rules, no black and white, but you can invent rules for yourself or for the project, or you can use limitations intentionally just to force yourself to work within those limitations, which is again a little creative then, but it turns it into, it creates a framework for the project. So he says that at some point these limits help move the project forward and might even inspire you to think outside the box a little, and just get things done, basically. So I don't know how you feel about that, and when things turn into a more systematic process for you, Malcolm.
Yeah, I agree on those points as well, because there's a law of diminishing returns when you're making a record, and you do start getting tired of it and less inspired, and that's again problematic with the usual keeping vocals till later in the recording thing. Is by the time you get to vocals, your singer's kind of doesn't care about the song. That's a problem.
Yeah.
So yeah, you definitely have to have the craft ready, but hopefully still staying creative in that moment as well, because like you said, ideas could keep coming. So you have to capture those while simultaneously checking the boxes that you need to check. But there's one, I'll paraphrase one quote from this book that I really loved, and it's something along the lines of, a painting is just a painting until it's hung on a wall, and at that point it's art. And that, I think, is a gut punch for a lot of DIY recording musicians who maybe haven't gotten something past the finish line yet. And it's yeah, you're making a song, you're making a recording, but until you actually get it released, now you've put art into the world, and you have to do that for it to really count. Otherwise, it doesn't really exist yet.
It's a file on your hard drive. Right? It's nothing else.
Yeah, exactly. It's just zeros and ones on a computer until you release it. So until people are listening to it.
Yeah, totally. That's so good, that quote. I don't even remember that, but it makes so much sense. Yeah, until it comes out of this. And even then, when you release it, only the moment with music, it's even, with a picture is actually the moment when somebody looks at it, but with music is when it comes out of the speakers. And until then, it's nothing really, But so, yeah, totally.
Yeah, until somebody listens to it.
Yeah, totally. Awesome. So at some point, this becomes important, and then we need to make intentional writing and engineering and arrangement decisions. And this is also where whereas, like I said, some rules and best practices start to make sense, at least at starting points. It's important what you said, Malcolm, that they can always be questioned, those rules that you create for yourself or those best practices that you use. They can always be questioned, and you should stay open for creativity. But we shouldn't spend too much time experimenting when we're past a certain point in the process if we don't want to lose what we already have and if we want to actually finish it at some point. So there's this balance there. I think it also has to do with confidence. If you know that what you have is good and it is the way it should be, then there's no need for further experimentation at some point. You just commit. You know that this is great. This is exactly what I want. And of course, you could try every single thing in the world. And in the mix, you could try every single plugin there is. But if you exactly know, if you have that vision, you know what you want it to sound like, and you found something that worked, why would you try everything else? Just move on and commit at some point, because otherwise it will never be finished.
Yeah, I think, well, I was going to say, I think that if you're like questioning every creative decision while you're doing the craft, the recording part of it, you probably aren't finished with the creative side. You've probably moved into the craft too soon. So I think the point that Rick Rubin's making and that we're making here is that when you move into the craft, the decisions are made because you've had the creative section really thought out. You know what the vision is. You've made the song the best song it can be. So at this point, it is. Those decisions are made. Let's capture it. You don't need to try and be creative anymore. It's kind of already done.
Yes, totally. And I think when, again, I'm constantly keep thinking about, because that's why I said in the beginning that every phase actually has this craft and creative aspect to it in a little bit, but to varying degrees. There's always a little bit of both in all these things. But I think the closer we get to the finish line, the more the craft becomes important. And when we get to like what he calls the completion phase at the end, that is really where you can sabotage yourself by starting all over again. This is sometimes when people who just want, this is not so much the case for self-recording bands probably, but there's situations in like with label productions when close to the end of a project, when everybody loves it and it's almost done, and then somebody from the label or somebody else who thinks they have to have an opinion on it, they come in and they want to change something now and want to go back to the start and change a part, or get rid of a part or add a part or whatever. And this can really sabotage the whole project, and it's at some point it's just not a good idea. At some point you just have to move on and complete it and be happy and stoked about what you did and put it out there in the world proudly and not question everything and start over again. But I think if you're that far with your own project, this is likely not going to happen. So I think I hope so, at least. I think the closer you get to the finish line, the more the craft is important, and the more you need to just make sure that you get it done. Also, the whole thing about the planning and thinking about the why and everything, and like what got us here. Why is this important to us? Why do we want to bring this to life? Who are the people, who are the best people to do it? Who is this for? All those things. These are questions you can and should ask yourself, I think, once you have a clear vision, once you have turned one of those seeds into a draft, and then you know what it's going to be like, and then you can ask yourself these questions. And I also think that they're in between the initial, to me at least, the initial creation phase and then the final stages of the craft phase, because they inform the decisions you're making in the craft phase. So, for example, if I know that I have a certain identity as an artist, I have a certain aesthetic, or like the song is about a certain thing and therefore needs to sound aggressive or whatever, or if my goal is to be on a certain playlist where things obviously sound like that or whatever, without trying to recreate the exact same thing, then there are probably some decisions you have to make to increase the chances of that happening. And I think that then these questions and the planning and the why behind it and who this is for and so on and so forth, I think this informs engineering decisions. And so you have to ask yourself this before you move on at some point, because otherwise I could see, I don't know, if I'm there, like I'm just imagining myself mixing a song and the band gives me zero direction. And yeah, I can do what the song tells me, but if I don't know what the band actually wants, what they like, what they don't like about other music, what their goals are, and I can only guess and I can only hope that my interpretation of what the music tells me is correct, but I could be completely wrong. But if I have that direction, if people have asked themselves these questions, I most of the time have a very clear idea of what to do to help them achieve that. And those are always the projects that end up, where everybody ends up happy and like people actually achieve their goals. So this is why I'm always asking people this, and why the planning is important, but not before that initial part. I think somewhere in between there.
Yeah. Here's another idea from the book that I found really fascinating, and it was like the idea that nobody will perceive your art the same way. So your song's not going to make everybody feel the same way. It might be a sad song, and there will be, make people feel sad, like bold, broad thing. Yeah, maybe. But why they're going to find it sad is going to be totally different for everyone.
Depending on what they've experienced in their life and like
or where they heard it. Like I've got a John Butler Trio song, showed it to JBT, that like makes me so sad because I associate it with a funeral that I went to. The song's not about that funeral. It's not about that person. It's called Peaches and Cream. But like it has extremely specific memories for me, and JBT didn't write it with that in mind. Like he could never have predicted that song would mean that to me. So I think the suggestion was more so, instead of trying to make people feel a thing, try and make you feel something, and then people are gonna interpret it their own way from there. So, which is really interesting, because I think maybe prior to that, like, thinking about that idea, I would have been like, okay, what's the message of this song? We're going to convey that message. But really, you have to make it for yourself and tell yourself that message, or whoever you're writing it to. That's another possibility. But you only really get to communicate with yourself or one other person, maybe. And then everybody else interprets themselves. So it's just like, that's a huge thing that changes everything if you think about it that way.
Absolutely. So glad you brought that up. That's actually a core concept that he follows. He follows throughout the book, where he says it multiple times. And he says it in interviews too. The audience comes last is something he always says. And what he means by that is, of course, we want it to be heard and we want to reach people. But when we create something from nothing, we don't think about the audience. We think about we make what we want to make. Whatever we want to make as artists, we do that. And maybe we write it for one other person, like you said, somebody you can clearly communicate with, but not for a general broad audience. Later in the process is a little different thing, but that's then more like, how do we market it? And that's a different thing. That's not the artist's job, basically. Or like for some people these days it is, but you know what I mean? But in the beginning, when we're really in artist mode, in creation mode, we make it for ourselves. And only if we are really, really, really happy about it, and if it makes us feel something, we're onto something. And if it's something that we're not sure about, but we assume people are going to like it, that's probably not going to work. And that's not how you create art. And that's so cool, because I forget that sometimes. I'm such a planner, and I'm so strategic about everything, that I sometimes forget to just do it for myself and don't care about any outcome or result or anything. That's why I wanted to talk about this, because in the beginning, none of that does matter. Later in the process, it matters. And in the craft phase, it matters to a degree, because there is such a thing as like a certain commercial standard when it comes to mixing and mastering. And even Rick Rubin follows that, because he knows that, you got to do certain things for it to be successful and to be heard. But in the beginning, when you create the art, the audience comes last.
Yeah. It's hugely powerful idea of like just not worrying about what somebody else is going to think it's about entirely.
Yes, totally. Cool. So if we think about it that way and we separate the craft and the creation, then another thing it happens is we can show up to do either or, and we can focus on the task at hand, and we'll get the most out of both, instead of constantly doing it all at the same time. So like you said, Malcolm, when people move too early into the crafts phase, when they're actually not really sure what they want to create, it can be difficult to do either of them right. So just throughout the day in your life as an artist, be creative, capture ideas, always be in this sort of crafts phase. But then when you take something and move on with it and develop it into something, at some point, move away from that a little bit and move into the crafts phase, and then focus on that. Similar to what I describe in my process when I say, when you're in the session with an artist or yourself, ideally, all you want to focus on is getting the best possible performances, like really capturing this moment, focusing on the performance, on the vibe, on the feeling of the take, and not about how to, set up some piece of gear or navigate the DAW, or if the song is even done completely written or whatever. These are things there's another time and place for that before, and you should prepare that. But being able to just focus on one part of the process is huge. And if we don't think about it that way, we're constantly in both modes, basically. And this is relatively hard to do, because then we ask too strategic questions when we should actually just create freely, or we are not focused enough when it's actually time to execute. And it's kind of hard. So I think separating the two is a really good idea.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. You don't want to confuse the steps, I think. That's a big part of it.
Yeah. While being open enough to creativity throughout, because you never know. The best, you could have sometimes in the session, some spontaneous thing is the best idea ever, and then you have to just do it. That can happen.
Absolutely.
But,
yeah, and it's so fun when it does.
Yeah.
but if the entire recording session is about that, you're not going to get a lot done.
Exactly.
And you essentially are admitting that you don't have a clear vision yet,
yes.
Right?
So there are some notes I made for myself that I want to just talk about, some cool parts of the book that I wanted to bring up. So, for example, he says the Andy Warhol, one of the most famous artists of all time. I didn't even know that. I didn't study him that much or anything, but I didn't even know that. Rick Rubin says in the book that Andy Warhol didn't paint a lot of there's many paintings of him, or many pieces of art that he didn't do himself. He had the vision for it. He wanted it to look a certain way. But he actually hired people or had people execute it for him. He didn't even do it himself, and that's totally fine. And it's one of some of his most famous pieces that people absolutely love. And he just brought up that example as it's a skill to know that when you are not the best person to actually do the job. So you might be an awesome guitar player, but for some reason, this specific thing, there's another player that is just better at that. Or you might be an awesome mixer, but you cannot mix your own. Maybe you're having a hard time mixing your own music, and handing it off to someone else is the better idea. It doesn't mean that you are a bad artist or bad at your craft or whatever. It just means that in this situation, there's someone else who can do it better, and that's a skill to be able to know that, and then to be able to also follow through with that and actually do it. And Rick Rubin does that so well. He knows exactly what he can't do well, and so I just love that.
Absolutely, yeah. That's very telling, actually. It's as successful of a painter as you can imagine, didn't do it all themselves. It's why can't musicians? I mean, some musicians totally get on board with that, and I've had very successful careers as a result. But it's a hard jump to make, so consider that.
Yeah, totally. Then he says he asks a lot of what if questions in the early stages, before he starts to plan, when everything's really free and creative. And I love that too, where he says you have something that most people do in a certain situation, some best practice, and then he goes, what if I do the exact opposite? What if instead of, you hear something that you have to do, I can't think of a good example now, but he always takes every piece of advice or every best practice that there is and asks, what if I do the exact opposite? Or what if I go, what if I record on the beach instead of at the studio? Or if I, these sort of crazy things, the exact opposite of what people tell you to do. And most of them won't work, but sometimes there's something that is just the right thing to do. And he constantly keeps asking himself these what if questions in all kinds of directions before he enters sort of the craft phase. And I love that. He says often it's the exact opposite. Sometimes it's slightly different, but always what if? And everything is allowed. Just ask these questions and then try it. What if?
That's when I said that this book is challenging me to think in different ways, that's one that I'm really challenged to consider, because I can just imagine being the producer and the artist is just and what if? And what if? And what if? We're never going to get anything done.
Yeah.
But he's not wrong. You're going to eventually discover something very cool and interesting. I'm trying to take that idea seriously, but I do struggle with it with my brain. But if I were to take that approach, you just need to allot the right amount of time to explore those what ifs.
Yes, and we have to add here, he doesn't do that in a this is not done when you book a studio.
Yeah.
Maybe if you have the budget for it, but this is not when people come to us as producers, they book a studio to record their record. We're not constantly asking what if questions in that situation, because there's no time and budget for that. But you have to imagine that in Rick Rubin's case, he's working with the artist a long time before they actually even go into a studio. They would go, like, they travel, they spend time together at some house or whatever. They would go on walks. They would, they spend a lot of time together, capturing seeds and developing them into drafts. During that process, where he's with them, like in the writing process, or when the artist is on their own, that's where the what if questions make sense, but not then when you actually booked a bunch of people and engineers and a studio and all of that. Like that would drive everyone crazy. So
Costs you a lot of money too.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also a lot of money too if you do that with Rick Rubin, but you just have to put that in perspective that he's the type of producer who would spend a lot of time with people before it's time to track. And this is something I think that many self-recording bands don't even realize or are aware of, that making a record isn't like you jam in your jam space and then you go to the studio and you record it. There's this whole pre-production, demo, writing phase before it that people do when they make like these professional records. And people might not even be aware of that process, that producers are oftentimes involved a long time before you even enter the studio.
Yeah, that's a huge separation between like that level, big budget level productions. That's a very common case. Is this pre-production phase is a huge thing that a lot of work is put in by the artist and the producer, and then there's a recording. Where at the indie level, that whole step is skipped usually, which is a bit of a mistake. And I mean, it's easy to understand why, because bands can't afford to double what they're paying their producer usually. And it's at least that amount of work to, like, if you're going to do 2 weeks of recording, you definitely need 2 weeks of pre-production, I would say. So it's easy to understand why, but as the Self-Recording Band podcast, we just encourage you to do it on your own. Yeah, so if you, we're encouraging you to do the production and recording on your own too, but if you are going to hire a producer and you can't do that pre-production phase with them, just make sure you do it yourself at least.
Yes, which is exactly why I created this coaching program, by the way, because if you work with me there, I'm not just going to show you how to operate the DAW and your interface and capture your tracks. We're going to work on all these other phases too, like the arrangement, the pre-pro, the demos, and people are always surprised how long it actually takes until they actually get to record something. And this is exactly why. If you need help with that, by the way, like shameless pitch here, if you need help with that, by the way, go to the selfrecordingband.com/call and let's chat about this on a call, what that would look like. So another concept he says that I also loved. He talks about the revision process, and he's not only talking about audio, by the way. It's like aimed at artists in general, but he always uses like audio examples because that's his background, of course. And he talks about the revision process, and I don't know if you got there already, Malcolm.
No, I don't think so.
That was so cool because he says the way people usually do revisions is they listen to a mix, they make a bunch of notes, like a list of things they want to change. They send it to the producer or the mixer. They implement those changes, they send it back, and then people look at their list, listen to the song, and check if the things that they wanted have actually been done. And he says that's so wrong because everybody does that and it's understandable, but you do it because there's an ego that plays a role here, where you want to make sure that you got heard and that your suggestions and your comments were taken seriously and that people actually implemented that. And when they've done it, you're like, check, everything's done. Cool, mix is done. The better way to do it would be to make your list, submit it, let them do the revision, then listen to the new version without looking at the list again, and just create a new list. And there might be things that were on the old list. There might be completely new things now that happened as a consequence of those changes. Some changes might turn out to be not a good idea, or they have like side effects that you didn't expect or whatever. But just try to listen to it as if you heard it for the first time without looking at your previous list, because it's not about making sure that they actually did everything you asked them to. It's about making sure that the song is done. And you don't really know if your comments really made sense. But and that I loved that, because that's exactly what everybody does. They want to make sure that their comments have been implemented and then it's good. But they forget to listen to the song again and double check if it actually works now.
Yeah, they're just listening for changes, which is like what that doesn't matter. In fact, like this seems like a good idea to implement before you even make a request for revisions. Like the first time you listen to it, make a list, and then do it again, but make a new list and see if the same things are on it, right? Like give it a little time between and make a new list as if you hadn't written the first one. do they match? Maybe that thing that doesn't appear on list 2 doesn't matter. Maybe you were wrong about that.
Totally good idea, actually. Yeah, for sure. I just thought that was a great idea, and yeah, awesome, cool. Now, we talked about that. He says like change the way you create, break your routines and patterns. So there were, he there were some crazy extreme examples there. He said he didn't say names, but he says he worked with some singer. They just couldn't get the right take, or not the right take. They tried to come up with a vocal idea, actually, with like lyrics and the melody, and nothing they tried really worked, and they were blocked, and it was frustrating. And they tried all kinds of things and weird places, and they really tried to mix it up, but nothing really worked. And then the singer just ended up, he was like hanging upside down from the ceiling, and in a writing session for hours, like, and he was like, with breaks in between, but he was just hanging upside down from the ceiling, and trying to get to ideas that way, and that actually worked. It was so uncomfortable and so outside of what he would usually do that it somehow. But he was unblocked and was able to then all of a sudden have ideas and do creative things. You don't have to be that extreme, but it just goes to show if we just break our usual routines and patterns, it could be enough to just go to another room or move to another chair in the room, or, just break some sort of pattern, go somewhere, rent some, I don't know, go to an Airbnb for a weekend or whatever. Try to do something different if you're blocked, and that can really help. And some people might even go as far as like hang themselves upside down from the ceiling. So
yeah, there's like endless proof of this. When you buy a new guitar pedal, you invariably end up writing a riff, right? When you jam with new people, you write a song and you're like, we should start a band. Like, it happens all the time. It's this new combination of ingredients yielding a new result. So it's like kind of an obvious one, but it's harder to recognize that you're stuck than you would think. So you don't realize that you've just been trying to make music in the same room over and over and over again with the same setup, same sounds, and you're not getting any new input, so you're not going to get any more output after a certain point.
Yes, yeah, totally. And I also think it's just I don't know what it is, if there's just new impressions, new things around us that we don't know. I think there's like a subconscious thing where we want to explore what's around us, and so we're a little busy with like taking in all these new things, these new impressions, and that maybe frees up another part of our brain that can actually be creative then, versus being exactly at where we always at, where we know everything and where we don't have to think about it, and then maybe we're too focused on just creating. We need some sort of distraction. That's also why he says that some people can be creative while like going for a walk or driving their car or washing dishes or whatever. Some sort of activity that needs a little bit of brain power, not much, just a little bit, but can basically run on autopilot. But it keeps you busy enough so that a different part of your brain is free to do other things. And I can see how that works. And so breaking those patterns and routines does a similar thing. You just, there's a little bit something new and exciting, and then you kind of distracted, and that opens up to other parts that are creative.
Definitely. Yeah. The book deals a lot with that kind of subconscious level of thinking and creativity, which is, again, like a hard thing for a very technical person like me to grasp and get behind, where I just want to be like, if I do this, I get this. But it's not as simple as that with creativity, of course. So it has been a good read for me to just like reassess those types of things.
Yeah, for sure. And then the other way around is also, he says, like, sometimes some people need routines and seemingly stupid rules if they help, So sometimes it's good to break the routines, and sometimes it's good to just stick to your routines if that's what you need and if that's what you need to function. And he says some hilarious examples too. I don't know who the artist is. I think in this case he even says the name, but I don't remember. He says that there was two artists who would always write together, and they had a ritual where one of them would bring a suitcase that was full of like silly hats, just silly, stupid hats. And before the session, he would open up the suitcase, and the two of them would like grab one of those hats, like randomly, put them on, and then they would write. And that was their routine. Like, they would just pick one of those silly hats, put them on. Like, no, they were no talking about it. Like, just put the hat on, and then they would write, which is hilarious.
That is truly hilarious.
It's
like putting on, like walking a day in somebody else's shoes, but it's a hat.
Yeah, I love that idea. But that's what they need, and they say that they can't write if they don't do that. that? And Rick Rubin says, like, whatever helps, like, do that if that is what works for you, you know?
Yeah, there is. It's hilarious because this kind of seems like we're saying the opposite of what we just said, but there's
Yeah.
this artistic process that you can really hone and get protective of. Like writers are notorious for this, where they'll have their writing routine in the same space with the same music on or the same everything, cup of coffee, and that's an effective way of them just training themselves to know, okay, when I sit in this chair, I write my book, and that I don't stop until this time, and I do that every day, and it's always the same. So I'm always in the same mindset of this story, and I think that could be used for music a lot as well. But I think on the flip side, what this book is really suggesting as well is like if you get stuck, vary the input,
Yeah.
and you'll probably get unstuck.
Yeah. And totally. And he says that actually too. He says that you show up and do the work anyways, even if you don't feel like it. We've talked about that concept a lot also on the podcast. You don't have to do it for hours then if it just doesn't happen, but you still, if you don't feel like it, show up and do the work. And the constant like making notes and inspiration, and that happens all the time, but there are still blocks each day or each week or whatever your schedule is where you just sit down, preferably in the same spot. You show up to work basically, and you just write. And there's a lot of days where it feels like a waste of time because nothing comes out from it and you feel like you have to force it and it's not going to work. But then there will be the occasional day where it absolutely works. And then when that happens, the key is then to have the flex, if possible at all. Like you have to, the key is to have the flexibility, like when it comes to timing and everything, to then follow through and don't stop until it's done. So ideally, you pick a writing block at, I don't know, Friday evening, Saturday evening, something where you know when it happens. There's nothing after that that could stop me. And then you just show up, you do your 2 hours or whatever. And if it doesn't happen, you just quit and move on and show up again the next day. But when it happens, you can spend all Saturday night just following through until the song is done.
Yeah, and slight little separation here. Writing can be creating these seeds, these ideas, just trying to work at stuff until an idea comes up, or it can be harvesting those ideas that have already happened as well. So you pull up the phone memo of the riff that you thought of, then hummed into your phone while you were working, and you try and work on that kind of thing. It's both sides of that.
Yeah. Exactly. You can sit down and use those memos, or you can just sit down and like look out the window and observe and wait until something happens that inspires you to start writing. And if not, then you just sit there for 2 hours, and it's not a waste of time because you just showed up anyway. And then on another day, something will happen that inspires you. You can go for a walk or whatever. That's also part of the work, even if nothing comes out of it at that moment. So both things can work. Yeah, you're right. And then the final thing is that I made a note about is the demoitis thing, where this goes into why at some point we need to move on, and we need to have this like a rather systematic approach and move into the craft phase and just also create deadlines and like structures for ourselves, because when you spend too much time on something, you get so attached to it and so used to it that you're not open to any changes anymore, and you don't see any possibility to improve things, or you don't, when someone has a good idea, you can't accept it. And that happens when you spend too much time on the project. So at some point, after you have a vision and a draft that you're really excited about, you need to make sure that it's done rather quickly before you get so attached to it that there's no way you can change it anymore, or there's no way you can let those creative moments happen for the rest of the project. So that this is this tricky balance here, where there's a time and place for no rules, no limitations, nothing. But then there's also a time and place for focused work and moving rather quickly before you lose any sense of like objectivity and perspective.
Yeah.
And the demoitis is real. Yeah. So, and the demoitis is absolutely real. I'm battling with that a lot. Like, I just had a project. I'm not going to say who it is, but it just mixed a project where I love them. I love the band and I love their songs. But I've mixed them, sent it to them. I was super excited about them. And there were some things in the revision request that they had that made me really question my work, where I was like, really? Like, did I make that big of a mistake? So I maybe something went wrong. So I opened up the session to check if something went wrong, and no, it was exactly the way I wanted it to sound like. And I didn't really get why they would want me to change certain things that way. until I listened to their rough mix again. I had done that in the beginning, but then ignored it for a while to be more objective. But then I listened to their rough mixes again, and I realized that these were all things that they had heard for a long time in their own demos and their rough mixes. And although I still think those weren't necessarily good decisions, they were so used to them that they can't hear the songs without those things. They can only hear them that way, and this is really challenging then, because I know that they're sabotaging themselves, but they just can't accept my suggestion because they've been listening to their work for way too long, and they should have gotten outside opinion more quickly, or handed off to someone more quickly. I know that the production process took quite a while, and so they've just spent too much time with their own material.
Yeah, that's kind of a time is of the essence situation again. Yeah, it's like the law of diminishing returns.
Yeah, totally. And this is totally normal, by the way. So I'm not throwing anybody under the bus here. Like, this is a very normal situation, and I'm probably the same when I write things. If I've spent too much time with it, I love what I've done, and I'm having a hard time accepting outside opinions, and so this is very normal. Anything to add to this, Malcolm? This is a long monologue, basically, because I read my notes here, but I just wanted to put that out there because I found it really, really interesting.
Yeah, no, it is inspiring. And again, the guy's credits are just so out of this world. And if you're going to check out his book, what's his book called again? By the way, we should
The
give
Creative
a shout out
Act.
to
The Creative Act by Rick Rubin. And what we talked about here is only like scratching the surface. Like, not even like, this is such a long read, and great audiobook. He reads it himself.
Yeah. I was going to say I recommend the audiobook because you can really it's really convincing that he actually lives his life through these principles of creativity first, and really working on the subconscious levels of creativity and just non-tangible stuff that's really hard to get behind. So hearing him and believing that, okay, this guy's actually walking the walk, and talking not just talking the talk, is impressive, and makes me want to try and do things that way and see what results come of it. And yeah, it's just really convincing. It's very counterintuitive to just grinding and trying to work harder. So I think everybody should check it out if you're creative. And of course, you're a creative if you listen to this podcast.
Yeah, totally. Also, again, goes to show that a producer, it also helps you understand, I guess, what a producer actually is when we talk about a producer, because a lot of people, these days, the meaning of that word has changed a little, and we've talked about that on the show before too. And someone in your band has to sort of wear that producer hat, and that doesn't mean they have to turn the knobs, but they are they have the vision. They are guiding the rest of the band. They are like the movie director. And the engineer and the producer are not necessarily the same person. And Rick Rubin is the perfect example for that, where it's really, he's producing without ever touching any piece of gear. He's just there guiding everyone in the room, building the team. And I think that's an important concept to understand too, because I really think that a lot of DIY mixer or DIY recorders, producers, bands, self-recording bands, they don't really have a producer. They have the musicians and the writers. They have an engineer, maybe a mixer or mastering engineer, but they're lacking a producer. There's no one who actually makes these creative decisions, who has these ideas of how the project will go. The person who plans that stuff out, who they don't have that. They write, they jam, they practice, then they capture that in the recording process. They skip the whole thing that comes before that usually, and even while they're recording, there's no producer in the room, and then that's what they have. And so think about if someone can be the producer, or if you as a band can be the producer, or if you need an outside producer, because I think that it's, in most cases, or in almost every case, it's really beneficial. And we even have an episode, I think, that's called you need a producer, even if that is yourself or something like that. Think about that, the difference between an engineer and a producer, and how you could implement that. Maybe you can sort of assign roles within the band. Maybe you have someone who loves the technical side of things, who has great technical ability, can operate the DAW, can edit and all of that. And then maybe there's a super creative person in the band who doesn't want to do anything with the gear, but has great ideas and a great vision. And maybe you can build a team with your superpowers and make records that way. So that's a big takeaway from this too, I think.
I think a lot of people, they get burnt out on recording and stuff like that, it's not the creative part that's burning you out. It's probably the over focusing on the technical side of things. And this book is going to help you understand the creative side of things a lot better, and probably appreciate and value it more as well. Rick Rubin values it above all else. And I don't think that would be true for most of our listeners at this point, that they're putting equal efforts into creativity as much as they're putting into trying to make their guitar sound freaking awesome on the, tone-wise. So it's a really good wake-up call and reminder about how important that first step of this whole process is. And if you can keep that enjoyable, fun, and thriving in your musical life, it's going to make for a much more sustainable career in music.
Yes. All right. That was a cool one. Well, we'll see. After you finish it, Malcolm, maybe there's some other concepts that we can, talk about in the future, or that we can just, this is also an inspiration for us and for other episodes that we'll do. Maybe we'll pick
absolutely.
up some concepts there.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to listening to more of it. I kind of think this is going to be a very influential book on my life, honestly. It's quite profound.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Awesome. Cool. Now, I'm glad we're back, Malcolm. This is a lot of fun. Let's continue on Monday. And it's not too long until I'm actually at your place. Super excited about that.
We'll be doing an episode in Canada, believe it or not, together.
Yeah. I mean, can we say that we do that? I don't know. I don't want to put any pressure on you because of the wedding and everything. We'll probably get one done.
We got to make one in-person episode happen.
Yeah, I'm gonna carry you like a small rig with me anyway. So
you don't need to. We can do it when you're staying at my place. We'll just gear.
Okay. Because we'll talk about that because I have my laptop with me anyways because I got to work. But I'm not sure if I actually need to bring a mic then, for example.
Right.
But
yeah. Up to you.
Okay.
Course,
okay. Cool.
Yeah, and you can always borrow stuff off me too.
Yeah, perfect. Looking forward to that. All right, thank you for listening. This is a long one. I hope you stayed with us. If you did, thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next week.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Okay, bye.